Today we're going to talk about photosynthesis and give an overview of the process. Before we can talk about photosynthesis, we need to remember what the word energy means. Energy is the ability to do work, and it comes in many forms. So there's light energy, heat energy, electrical energy, and chemical energy, for example. ATP is a molecule. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it's made of three different parts. It's made of an adenine, so that's this group here. It's made of a ribose sugar, that's this, and then it's also made of three phosphate molecules. This molecule is used to store temporarily and release energy, so it's kind of the energy molecule of the cell. A molecule that's related to ATP is ADP. It stands for adenosine diphosphate. The difference is that it contains only two phosphate molecules instead of three, like adenosine triphosphate did, and it acts like an uncharged battery. If you add a phosphate, it becomes ATP and becomes more energetic. ATP can release energy when the bond between the three phosphates is broken between the second and third phosphate. When that happens, energy is released, and so when ATP exists, it's like a charged battery waiting to release energy. There are two major types of organisms that use energy. One of those types are heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are organisms that obtain energy by eating other organisms. So you are a heterotroph, your dog is a heterotroph, your cat is a heterotroph. Anything that's alive that does not make its energy from photosynthesis is a heterotroph. So herbivores are heterotrophs, carnivores are heterotrophs, omnivores are heterotrophs, and decomposers like fungi are also heterotrophs. Autotrophs, on the other hand, are organisms that make their own food using energy from the sun. So they can collect energy from the sun in the form of light through this process called photosynthesis, and they use that energy to convert the light energy into chemical energy, and they store it into sugars. So autotrophs include things like plants, algae, and some species of bacteria. So this process that plants use, called photosynthesis, is when plants convert energy from the sun into chemical energy and store it in carbohydrates. So photosynthesis literally translates into photo, meaning light, and synthesis, to make something. So we use photosynthesis to make sugars. Light is the form of energy that comes from the sun to the earth. We see it as white light, which is actually a mixture of all of the different colors, and white light contains wavelengths of light that include red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. So those are the colors of the rainbow. Light travels in waves, so we can determine the color of the light by its wavelength. And so the visible light spectrum, so light that you can see with your eyes, is between 400 nanometers and 700 nanometers. So those are the wavelengths of visible light. Other types of light exist. There's ultraviolet light, and that exists between 300 and 400 nanometers, and infrared light, which we feel as heat, and that exists between 700 and 800 nanometers. But any of the light that you can see is between 400 and 700 nanometers. The color of a plant that we see is determined by its pigments. So the way that we know what color a pigment is that it absorbs energy from specific wavelengths. So for example, when you are looking at a plant, so here we have a picture, crudely drawn because I'm no artist, of a plant. And so when the sun comes, or when the light comes from the sun, all of the wavelengths of light come together. So there's red and blue, green and yellow, and they all strike the plant together. However, all of this tissue in the plant absorbs those colors except for the green light. The green light is reflected from the plant, so it bounces off, and that is what the person sees when it reflects from the plant. And so the plant pigments, such as chlorophyll, absorb all of the colors of the visible spectrum of light except the green light, and the green light bounces off and strikes the eye of the person looking at it. So that's how you can tell what color the plant is. Chlorophyll is the principal pigment found in plants. There's two types, so there's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and they absorb light in the blue to violet and red regions as well, but they very much reflect green light, which is why plants appear green to your eye. Chloroplasts are organelles in the plants, and they are the site of photosynthesis, and they contain many thylakoids, which are structures that house some of the major proteins that are associated with photosynthesis, including chlorophyll, the pigment. In this diagram, you can see what plant cells look like. So here we've got a plant cell. You can see the cell wall gives them some rigidity, and within the plant cell, you can see each of these structures, these little green circles. Each of those is a chloroplast, and it contains lots of chlorophyll, and that is the part of the plant that looks green, and that's the part that carries out photosynthesis. Within each chloroplast, again, there's these structures called thylakoids. They're sac-like photosynthetic membranes within chloroplasts. So within each chloroplast, you'll have many, many thylakoids. They're arranged in stacks. The name for those stacks is grana, plural, or granum, singular. And they contain pigments such as chlorophyll. And they're surrounded within the chloroplast by a fluid called the stroma. So in this diagram, you can see what a thylakoid looks like. So there's a bunch of thylakoids within the chloroplast. So this whole structure is one chloroplast. And then you can see the thylakoids are these individual disc-like structures. And you can see that there's many of them stacked up on top of each other. When you have a stack of thylakoids, that's called a granum. When you have many stacks of thylakoids, that's called a grana, And then the fluid that fills this whole space is called stroma. So the function of the chloroplast is to collect energy, right? So when chlorophyll, the pigment, absorbs light energy, then a large portion of that energy is transferred to the electrons in the chlorophyll. And then these electrons are carried through the thylakoid, and they help to build molecules such as glucose. There are special molecules that are meant to carry electrons. An example is NADPH in plants, and every time electrons are collected during photosynthesis, NADPH can carry those electrons through the thylakoid, and it can use those electrons eventually to provide energy to build sugars. So here we have the photosynthesis equation. So during the photosynthesis equation, plants take in 6 carbon dioxide molecules, and then they also take in 6 water molecules, and then they use energy from the sun, and that energy is used to create a glucose molecule, and the waste product from photosynthesis is 6 oxygen gas molecules. So to summarize, the photosynthesis reaction uses carbon dioxide and water and energy from the sun to produce glucose and oxygen gas. The photosynthesis equation or process is carried out in 2 major steps. The first step is the light-dependent reaction. This uses light to produce energy-rich molecules such as ATP and NADPH. The byproduct of this process is oxygen gas. Then the second part of the equation is the light-independent reaction. So this part is not dependent on sunlight. It can happen after the sun has set if there's enough NADPH and ATP to help to drive this reaction. So here we use NADPH and ATP, and they're used to produce sugars from carbon dioxide.